What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we diving into the meta decks of Best of 1 in MTG Arena. We're about a week out after the release of Karlov Manor, and I kind of want to see what the top meta decks currently look like with the addition of these new cards. Was there really any impact to the top decks, or is it more of the same of what's kind of been at the top for the most part? With that being said, let's just dive into the decks and let's start talking about them. The first deck we have up is going to be Simic Artifacts, and this is kind of a fringe deck. It's kind of right outside the top 10, but it still has an overall decent win rate at a little bit over 54%. What it's trying to do is utilize things like Zodiac Glyph here, a 3-mana enchantment aura, enchants an artifact, it then becomes a 5/4 golem in addition to its other types. If this enchantment goes to the graveyard from the battlefield, you get to discover 3, which is quite good, which hits quite a lot of things from our deck overall. Another card in this deck that is quite strong as well is going to be the Agatha Soul Cauldron. This is something that we can start exiling things from our graveyard and putting +1/+1 counters on our creatures on the battlefield. And if any of the creatures that we have exiled and put underneath the cauldron have activated abilities, our creatures then will gain that activated ability on top of any other cards underneath it, which is also pretty sweet. It also plays things like Turthen Wormlet. It's a 1-mana 1/1. We have a decent amount of artifacts in here. We will be able to trigger this effect to either buff it up by giving additional +1/+1 counters, as well as getting a little points of life gain, which can be very helpful against more aggressive matchups. Definitely a very low to the ground deck. As you see here, we top off at 3, so really trying to get a decent curve with this deck is going to be quite good. It's going to be one of those things as we go further and further into the meta, as we get further away from the release of Karlov Manor. Is this going to be a deck that is going to hold itself and be in that top 10 or rise up and get a little bit better overall? Or is this going to be something that's going to be, on the fringe, definitely playable, definitely can get you some wins, but definitely something that may not be overall the most powerful deck in the meta. The next deck we have up is going to be Naya Humans, and this is going to be one of the many humans decks on this list. Yet again, another fringe deck, also coming in at a little bit over 54% win rate currently in the meta for Best of 1. A unique deck, kind of playing a mixture of some of the newer legend cards released in the past few sets, also having some of the regular favorites that would typically be in your normal humans deck in like the mono white variety. You have things like Luminarch Veteran here for a little bit of life game. Hopefully Initiate that gets bigger the more you attack with things that are bigger than it. Also be used for a little bit of enchantment and artifact removal. Another thing to note about the deck, it actually doesn't play any really big non-creature spells outside of the Alt-Miss Might. This is the only spell that's in this deck that isn't a creature. And basically what this does is it's kind of another removal spell. You can target creature control deals damage equal to twice its power to target or planeswalker you don't control. The deck is mostly legendary, so I would say it's like a Naya Humans legendary deck. Also takes advantage of a card, Roman Throne. Enters the battlefield, we can choose a creature type, so we can make this throne into a human. And then basically, anytime one of our humans would trigger an ability, it triggers an additional time, which is definitely pretty sweet, as there are cards that have sort of those additional triggers. Things like Helana and Elena get additional +1/+1 counters. Things like Adeline here getting the additional attack in humans. Also, things like Anam and Pakal, which is a great card that's going to generate a bunch of gnomes, grow this card much larger, and kind of overwhelm your opponent by getting very wide very quickly. Definitely kind of an interesting take, I think, on the humans thing, doing something a little bit differently than the typical mono white or maybe the Boros variety, which we'll get into a little bit later in the video. But definitely a cool deck. Definitely want to see how this shapes up as the meta develops even further. Is this a deck that kind of holds itself because it's playing some strong, powerful, legendary-esque creatures, or is it going to be something that's going to kind of fall off as the meta develops even further? The next deck up is going to be 5-Color Domain. This is actually a deck that's been around for quite some time. It has a lot of very powerful cards that take advantage of the various land types that you could have out on the battlefield. It plays the Triome lands that create 3 different types of mana. Also, they count as each land type, which turns things, a Leyline Bind, into like essentially a 1-mana card at flash speed, which is quite good. Other things that this deck does very well, it ramps up fairly quickly, overwhelming your opponents who maybe are on a little bit more of a slower strategy, more like mid-range. This is kind of a deck that kind of tries to get to like that turn 7, turn 8 as quickly as possible, so they can kind of overwhelm your opponent with very powerful spells. Various things that this deck includes that really does that is things like Up the Beanstalk. Whenever we cast our very expensive spells that are 5 or greater, we're going to get to draw a card. Also, when this comes into the battlefield, we will draw a card as well. You have things like Chrome Hose Shark. If we ever cast a non-creature spell, we get to incubate X based on that mana value of said spell. Topiary Stomper, a card that comes on the battlefield, essentially gets you a land, which is quite strong. In the 4-drop slot, you have Archangel of Wrath, a very good way of getting chunks of life back. Also, it is a 3/4 flying lifelinker, which is quite good. Depopulate, a little bit of spot removal for the board. You also have Sunfell, which is a very strong removal spell because it costs 5 mana. It exiles all creatures. It's kind of strong in a very aggro creature heavy meta, so definitely something that can exile a bunch of things, kind of turn the game into your favor. Also, you get a token based on how many things were exiled, so quite strong there. And then pretty much this 7-drop, 6 or higher drop slot is kind of where this deck takes over. You cast things like Leyline Binded on very important things your opponent's trying to do. You cast a Trumpet Incent Carnosaur to discover 5. Also can be used as spot removal if you really need it. Also, it's a 7/6, so definitely very big, definitely very hard to trump block. Definitely going to overwhelm your opponent that way. Herd Migration as a little bit of mana fix in the early game for some chunks of life. Also in the late game, if you draw this and you have your 5 different basic land types on the battlefield, you'll get a bunch of beast tokens that your opponent now has to either wipe off the battlefield or they have to start chump blocking because you'll slowly overwhelm them that way. Nissa here is kind of one of those cards that is a little bit of a card that can help generate tokens on the battlefield that are creatures, can destroy artifacts or enchantments if you really need that. Best case scenario here, you play Nissa and then you do the -7 and essentially just overrun your opponent with a bunch of damage. And then Atraxa is kind of like the grand top card of the deck just because it's going to be a card that is going to refill your hand back up. You get a card of each type from the top 10 cards you reveal from this effect. 7 mana, 7/7, Flying, Vigilance, Lifelink. It's a very strong card. Typically when this gets cast and you refill your hand back up, the game is essentially turned into your favor unless your opponent has really some sort of way to prevent you from really taking advantage of what you get, or you get a really bad Atraxa reveal. This deck is quite strong. It's definitely one of those decks that punishes more of the mid-range magic matchups in the meta. Also can be very good against the more aggressive aggro matchups, maybe not mono red so much, or like the Boros Convoke deck, but definitely a good deck. I think that will still, be here in the meta even after it develops over time because it is a deck that's been fine-tuned very well. After that, we're actually going to be moving into a Lifegain deck. This is Orzhov Lifegain. I've actually covered this deck multiple times on the channel already. It's a deck that is very good against metas where it's very aggressive. It's very good against those heavy, aggressive aggro decks because it's playing Lifegain. It kind of makes it seem like those decks that being super aggressive, like the mono reds, like the Boros Convoke decks, kind of hit you like a wet noodle. Basically, sure, your opponent may hit you for like 7 or 8 life, but then you're going to play a bunch of things that are going to gain you chunks of life. In your 1-drop slot, you have the 1-drop case that's going to gain you life whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control. You have the Lumark Veteran, same thing. When another creature enters the battlefield, you're going to gain 1 life. You have Ellis or Core, Sadistic Pilgrim, enters whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you're going to gain 1 life. So these 3 cards are very strong cards that are just going to help you gain those chunks of life back. We also play spells that take advantage of us gaining life with things like Amalia here. Whenever we gain life, we explore. And then you essentially start putting +1/+1 counters whenever you hit a non-land card. It also has Ward of Pain 3 life, which can become very important as the game progresses and your opponent's life total gets lower and lower. You have things like Voice of the Blessed, a 2-mana 2/2 that also gets +1/+1 counters every time you gain life. And then when it has 4 or more counters, it has Flying and Vigilance. And when it gets to 10 counters, it will gain Indestructible as well. Usually, typically, once it gets to like that 4 or more counters, it definitely is a very big problem on the battlefield. Deep Cavern Bat to disrupt whatever your opponent's trying to do. So if you're on the play, you definitely can look at your opponent's hand, maybe disrupt their next turn. It itself is a 2-mana 1/1 fly and lifelinker, so it also helps you with a little bit of life gain, and those little points of life definitely do matter as the game develops. In the 3-drop slot, you have things like Gumdrop Poisoner, a 3-mana 3/2 with lifelink. It also can create a food token, which helps you gain life. And then when ETBs, you actually can give target creature -X/-X, where X is the amount of life we gain this turn. If you play this after you've already gained a little bit of life, and then you also have things like the case, like the Veteran, or even the Ellis Oil Core, that will actually scale up because each of these effects will see this card and it will actually gain you life, and then this effect will then resolve, and then you can give much more -X/-X on one target creature, so you can actually scale that up much more efficiently. As well, there's Resplendent Angel. It's a card that exists. If you gain 5 more life, you start generating 4/4 tokens. It has a 6-mana ability, but typically it's really more so for that additional effect of just starting to flood the board with a bunch of tokens. Extraction Specialist is great about getting our little smaller creatures out from the graveyard back onto the battlefield. They can't attack or block, but it's one of those things. This card has lifelink, which is also very good. It's going to be very helpful to get things like Voice of the Blessed or things like Amalia. Even the bats, if the bats go into the graveyard, you can then bring them back and then basically disrupt your opponent's hand yet again. In the 4 and higher slot of this deck, you have things like Shieldred here, which is going to gain life every time you draw a card. It's going to punish your opponent every time they draw a card. You have Alcatraz, the Deepest Betrayal, a 5-mana 4/4 with Flying Lifelink. Whenever it attacks, each opponent discards a card. For each opponent who can't, you draw a card. And whenever your opponent discards a land card, you get a 1/1 bat. So just another kind of top-end-esque card for the deck that has a lot of lifelink. Definitely hard to deal with. Definitely punishes your opponent's hand. Gix's command is kind of like the board wipe, kind of whatever we need it to be when we do cast it. Either gives something we control +2/+1/+1 counters and lifelink. It destroys each creature with 2 power 2 or less. Return 2 creature cards from your graveyard to your hand, or make your opponent sacrifice the greatest power of card they control. So definitely a very effective way to kind of figure out based on when this is cast what you want to do with what abilities you choose of the two. And then the top end card, a little bit of removal. It's going to be Lockthwain Scorn or Virtual Persistence, 7 mana enchantment or 2 mana sorcery that gives target creature -3/-3, gains you 2 life. And then if you cast it for the 7 mana side, you're going to start bringing stuff back from any graveyard to the battlefield underneath your control. So definitely another card that's going to take over the game if this comes out. Also very good with spot removal spell with a little bit of life gain for only 2 mana. Like I said, this is kind of one of those decks that performs very well against the more aggressive matchups. It's definitely something that's going to take advantage of someone who's trying to be super aggressive and not really trying to interact with the board, trying to do damage to your face, and you're just gonna be like, okay, I'm just gonna gain a bunch of life. Yet again, if the meta slows down a little bit, this deck may not perform as well. But yet again, this is a great deck against those more aggressive matchups currently in the meta, so that's why this deck is probably currently here, because it kind of combats how aggressive those decks can be. The next deck up is our first control deck on this list outside of the 5-color domain, as this is actually like a pure control where it's trying to do a lot of things in the early game to kind of slow down the game into your favor. What it's doing is playing things like March to kind of spot removal things, playing Sunset Revelry to kind of put some tokens on the battlefield, gaining you some life as you take damage early on. And then if your opponent has more cards in hand, it's going to draw you a card. Soul Partition to get rid of maybe their card that's kind of the main card of what they're trying to do on the battlefield. We got some counter spells with a little bit of negate, got the No More Lies, both very strong counter spells. Temporary Lockdown if it's a deck that's going to try to go wide with a bunch of little small 1 mana or 0 mana or 2 mana creatures. Definitely a very strong card there. Celeste is here. These little life gain triggers, whenever it flips, they're going to be very strong. Also, just drawing a card and discarding a card if we choose to do so. Also, it's a kind of like a mana rock as well, so it kind of helps us get a little bit further ahead mana-wise. And then kind of we get into that top end of the deck, and what this is essentially going to do is going to try to play Wanderer and Emperor where the avenues kind of make sense. You're going to play maybe one they attack with one of their creatures that you want to exile from the game and gain some life, or you maybe can take advantage and you're going to play it in -1 and put a 2/2 samurai token, and then as the game progresses, you're going to plus the creature you create from this, or even your creature lands that you do have in the deck. Overall, very strong planeswalker, definitely very effective, definitely a very good way about gaining some life, also taking control of the battlefield. You also have Jace's The Perfected Mind, another planeswalker that's in the deck. This is going to punish your opponent for who digs a little bit deeper, taking advantage of those players who are playing like the 5-color control, where they're going to be taking chunks of their deck and putting it into their hand, and they're going to be at 30 or less cards pretty quickly. And essentially, you resolve this card, you minus X based on its loyalty, so you minus for 5, and then they mill 3 times. So essentially, you can play Jace, make him mill 15 cards, or you keep it on the battlefield and you slowly plus it, and they have to kind of deal with it before you minus X and take out a big chunk of their graveyard. Card like Memory Deluge is great for this deck because it just allows you to kind of look at the top X cards of your library, find very important cards based on how much mana it was cost. So if you initially you look at the top 4, grab 2 of them, then you flash it back for 7 mana and get to look at 7 total cards, which is quite strong. And then, of course, because it's a control deck, it wants to keep the battlefield clear and keep it into your advantage. You have things like Sunfall here for those creature-heavy decks. Exile all the creatures, you incubate X based on the number of creatures. You make an incubator token that you eventually could use as a card that will eventually take over the battlefield. If you do this for like 5 or more, your opponent only has then so many turns to then answer this card, which can be quite problematic. Also, Farewell, which is very good against decks that play a bunch of things. Exile artifacts, exile all creatures, exile all enchantments, and then exile all graveyards. So all those things are very strong. This is kind of like that nail in the coffin here. If your opponent's doing a lot of things, this one card could just reset the game and then put it into your favor, because typically the control decks, you're not really dumping your hand as quickly as maybe the more aggro decks. So if you cast this is going to be one of those things. Now you have a full grip, they have no grip, and then you're going to be in the driver's seat of then eventually taking the game over. And then it is a blue-white control deck, so pretty much what it is playing a decently large mana base. And then the other thing, too, in this deck, we have things like Restless Anchorage, a card that's going to eventually probably take the game over in by itself, because it is a 2/3 flyer that we can slowly grow by saccharine those map tokens, making it bigger when we don't hit the lands off the top of our library. But a very strong card in general, because sometimes in a control deck you want to hit lands, so be able to create map tokens and creating and getting lands from the top of your library is going to be very good. But overall, this is a very strong list. There are probably variations to this list. You got like the 2 mana, draw 2 cards, discard 2 cards, gain 2 life, flash it back type cards. Yet again, it's kind of finding your little bit of what you like about Azorius Control, but it's nice to see a little bit of a control deck that could survive a little bit in this kind of meta. Definitely a deck that's going to, take advantage of the slower decks of the meta, and then kind of have to draw the right cards to really be in the okay spot against the more aggressive decks of the matchup. But overall, very cool to see an Azorius, like a control deck, be here in the meta overall. The next list up is going to be Bant Toxic. And Bant Toxic is kind of one of those decks that's been around in the meta for quite some time. And this is one of those decks that doesn't care about your life total. All it's trying to do is get you to 10 poison. And it's just going to be playing a bunch of cards that really tries to accelerate that as much as possible. We have things like Venerated Rot Priest. It's a card that comes down that essentially makes it, if any spell targets any creature you control, your opponent gets a poison counter. So this is kind of how you get the ball rolling. We play things like Karlov Manor to protect our side of the battlefield. It also has Toxic 1. Sure, it can't block, but really this is more of a protection spell. You play Crawling Chorus as a way to get a 1-mana 1/1 out that can start poking at your opponent for 1 point of poison. In the 2-drop slot, you have things like the Jawbone Duelist. This is a 2-mana spell that's a 1/1 double strike. So basically, if it connects to your opponent, it's going to give them 2 poison in 1 attack. You have Squirrel's Hive, which slowly generates might tokens on the battlefield. You start getting a little bit wider, their poison starts going up, and then these things become more and more problematic because you're going to be generating them over the course of the game. And if they can't really deal with your board state, you're going to eventually have a much wider might board than they are. And then once you get to 3 or more poison counters on your opponent, you're going to have lifelink on anything that has Toxic, which can be quite strong. And to wrap it up, we kind of have the Annex Sentry in that top end 3-drop slot. It's a 3-mana 1/4 that can exile target artifact or creature an opponent controls of mana value 3 or less until it leaves the battlefield. And basically, as you see here, this deck doesn't really, like I said, care about what your opponent may be doing. It may, if your opponent has life gain, if your opponent has, control in matchup, all it needs to do is start getting that poison onto your opponent, and then it has a lot of cards in the deck that can kind of accelerate that process of getting additional poison counters. You have things like Serum Snare, which is bounce something back, and then proliferate. You have Experimental Augury, look at top 3 and then proliferate. You have Fate and Hope as a little bit of a bounce spell. You have March of the Swirl and Mist as a spell to target your things as well as the Fate and Hope, to give your ways of getting additional triggers of Venerated Rot Priest. In the mana base, you have things like the Seed Core, which can buff up your creatures that have Toxic once you get to 3 or more, which is quite good. You also probably have in here Mirrex, which can generate tokens, which is also a problem when you also have things like Squirrel's Hive. So basically, you can tap out every turn and at least get a 1/1. Even if your opponent wipes the battlefield, you'll still have a 1/1 that's going to be able to maybe get in for that 1 free point of attack and get that 1 Toxic and kind of keep on going, even if you have to slowly start rebuilding back up. Yet again, like I said, Toxic is kind of a unique deck. It kind of fits into a meta where there's a mixture of life gain, there's a mixture of aggro, there's a little mixture of control, and this is just a deck that's trying to get 10 poison on your opponent as quickly as possible. Definitely something that is probably going to be in the meta just based if the meta stays like this, because it kind of is very good against various matchups and definitely can get a decent win rate overall. And the next deck up is going to be Mono White Humans. And Mono White Humans has just been a deck that's been in the meta for quite some time. It's kind of had some shifts in what cards have been included, but for the most part, there's a lot of cards that are in this deck that have kind of not really changed too much. A couple cards that have been just in the meta for quite some time that haven't changed are things like Adeline, you have Brutal Cathar, you have Thalia, you have things like Squirrel Hive, you have Luminarch Veteran, and the other things that really have been that have been added over the course of maybe the past year are things like the Knight Errant Eos is a good way to refill your hand back up by convoking creatures that have Summoning Sickness out immediately. You have the Warden of the Sky, which you can untap 3 artifacts and/or creatures, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and scry during your turn. You have Squirrel Hive as great protection because you can pay life instead of paying mana to actually tap in and choose a color to give your creature protection from that particular, give your creature hexproof from that color until end of turn. Coppercoat Vanguard is a 2-mana creature that comes down and gives all your other humans you control ward, which is very strong. Intrepid Adversary is still in the list. It's a card that's going to pay 2 mana initially, get a 3/1, and then over the course of the game you can pay additional 2 the more mana you have, and give additional +1/+1 counter for each Valor counter on it. Overall, it's a very strong list. It's definitely a list that's, like I said, it's been around. It's been fine-tuned, I think, up to this point. As you see here, there's not really many new cards that really get added into this list that haven't been here already before this list. It's going to be one of those things probably until rotation happens, maybe once or twice, that this deck will lose enough key pieces that it won't be as good anymore. But overall, Mono White Humans is kind of that deck that's just been in the meta, and it's quite powerful and quite good and quite consistent about getting those wins. Now, the next deck up is going to be Jeskai Control, and out of all the ones that started getting closer to the top of this list, this is the one that I'm a little more skeptical about, just because the list that I see, it has a 55% win rate, almost 56% win rate, but this list that I pulled in is actually somewhere around 53% win rate, so it's definitely one of those things that I don't know what deck is getting that high win rate that's averaging up But overall, it's kind of a unique list. It's kind of added in red for some additional ways of doing spot removal that typically the Azorius Control deck can't do. It's playing some of the newer cards in the newer sets. You have things like Lightning Helix that's back into the format. You have things like Torch the Tower from Wilds of the Eldraine. You have Fires of Victory, which is kind of a card that's unique. It kind of deals damage based on your hand size, which is kind of interesting overall. Typically, your control decks do have ways of having full grip, so definitely good there. A little mixture of, things like Celestis, things like Dissipate as a decent counterspell that exiles it instead of going to the graveyard. Quick Study makes this list. Yet again, like I said, it's one of those things I'm not really sure what deck is making the high win rate, but this is definitely an interesting card in a format where there is Shieldred, but definitely 3 mana to draw 2 cards at instant speed can be very good. Ill-Timed Explosion, a card that, draws you 2 cards. You explode, you can discard up to 2 cards and deal X damage across the battlefield based on the highest mana value of the spell you discarded. Overall, yet again, most of the deck is not really too much different than what you would see in the Azorius deck. In terms of other cards, there is one Urzum, which is kind of like another card that can be a top-end card to kind of finish off your opponent. Also has a way of giving it protection with the clues you may generate from it, to give it ways of giving it lifelink, vigilance, and or hexproof. You have Intrude on the Mind, another card that's kind of interesting in making your opponent have to make a difficult choice. You will top 5 cards of your library, make 2 piles, your opponent chooses one, and then whatever goes to the graveyard, you're going to get a Thopter based on on that many cards that go to the graveyard. So overall, it's a very good list. Definitely kind of unique. It's definitely going to be one of those things. I'm not really sure if this is the list that will get you the high win rate, but as the meta develops further, we'll get variations of this list. I'm sure people will make decks that will get better win rates, so definitely going to be one of those things. Is this the better version of a control matchup in the current meta? Or you're better off just playing Azorius Control because it's a little bit more consistent and it's not going through more iterations to kind of figure out what cards are good, what cards are bad. But overall, it's an interesting list. Definitely something to check out if you're looking for something maybe a little bit different from maybe the blue-white control that has been in the meta for quite some time. But yet again, it's definitely something I'm going to keep an eye out for sure. After that, we move into Boros Humans. And this one I kind of find very funny compared to all the decks on this list. Essentially, this is a mono-white humans list, so I'm not really going to go into too much detail since I've already talked about this list. But all it really does, it splashes red for 1 card, and that card is going to be Immodane's Recruiter. It's a 3 mana 2/2. When it ETBs, you get to have all creatures you control +1/+0 and hasten at a turn. So basically, what this does is a little bit differently from the typical mono-white humans. It's going to build up a battlefield as the game progresses, and then it gets to a point where you feel like maybe you're overwhelming your opponent already, and you just play this card as a way to finish off your opponent. So basically, you generate a bunch of tokens over the course of the game. You play a lot of low-costing cards with the low curve that this deck does have, and then you play this card as that finisher. So that's really it. That's really the big difference. But this one is performing a little bit better because I do think that this 1 card allows the deck to be a little bit more aggressive than where the typical mono-white humans has to kind of take some time off because things have summon to sickness. None of the things have haste. But yet again, it's a very good deck. It's definitely something if you want to try out. All it is just one different card in the list compared to the other lists. But that's about it. Overall, cool deck. Not really too much different than the mono-white humans, but it is something that they call Boros Humans to say at the end of the day. I mean, it wouldn't be a meta list without mono-red aggro, and mono-red aggro is just that deck that's just going to be in the meta forever at this point, just because I feel like there hasn't been a meta where the mono-red aggro is not one of the top decks overall. The reason why mono-red or aggro decks that play red are very good and also make their way up the meta is because most of the creatures have haste, so if you're on the play, you get to go first, you get to play things that come down on 1 and immediately do damage on your opponent. You have things like Monastery Swiftspear, which comes in as a 1/2, can ping, you hit your opponent for 1 on turn 1, and then as you cast additional spells, it will start scaling up and do more damage. You have Phoenix Check as a 1 mana 1/1 flyer in haste, so definitely hard to deal with because a lot of the different decks don't really have a flyer that they can play early in the game to kind of block the Phoenix Check. You have things like Kamano Faces Kakazan, which makes we play this on turn 1 and then makes our 2-drop that much better because that 2-drop will now come in the battlefield with additional +1/+1 counter on it. You have your spot removal with Play with Fire, Lightning Strike, things that can go to your opponent's face as well. Monstrous Rage has been a very good addition to this deck because this is a 1 mana buff your card up +2/+0 and also give it a monster roll token. So basically it's a 1 mana, give target creature +3/+1 for that 1 turn, and then following that turn, that creature now has +1/+1 and trample as well, which is quite good. And combine that with a thing like a Monastery Swiftspear. Very aggressive way to attack and get big chunks of damage. Your opponent then can't really chump overall. As the deck progresses on, you have things like Bloodthirsty Adversary, just a solid 2 mana 2/2 haste creature. If you draw this later in the game, you can actually pay additional mana and then play spells from your graveyard based on how many times you pay that additional 3 mana, which is also quite good. You either cast additional Lightning Strikes, cast additional Monstrous Rays, Play with Fire, you get the point there. After that, you have Feldin here, which is always an interesting card. Typically most of the time your opponent has to find some sort of way to directly remove it without spot removal or deal damage to it, because they never want to give you those additional cards off the top of your library, because this is a very aggressive list. You're probably empty your hand very quickly, and your opponent's gonna be like, well, I don't want to give him 2 additional cards because that 2 additional cards could be what kills me. So also a very interesting card that seems to be always in any of the lists. You have Squee in the list as a 3-drop card that will give you itself plus additional 1/1. That's a card that you can eventually get back from the graveyard to the battlefield by paying 4 mana and exiling 4 cards from your graveyard other than paying its mana cost. You have Godric here, which takes advantage of things where, you play Kamano on turn 1, you play, Swift Spear, and then on turn 3, you play you play Godric, your Kamano flips over, it counts the flipping over the Kamano as a new permanent that enter the battlefield, which then triggers a celebration, which makes Godric a 4/4 the turn it comes out. After that, you have Witchstalker's Fentry. It seems like a very expensive removal spell, but the spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature that attack this turn. So basically, you attack in, and then you're able to do 5 damage immediately once you declare attackers, or even vice versa. Your opponent's being aggressive against yourself. You can, they tap X amount of creatures. You can then, shoot something for 5 damage, which is quite good as well. And because, yet again, this is a very low curve deck, doesn't play a ton of lands, has 17 mountains, has two Sokozans, as maybe another way to get some more aggressive creatures on the battlefield, or if you need blockers, you can generate 2 blockers. And then also Mistress Foundry is another creature land that also helps you get in for those additional points of damage if the battlefield it gets wiped for any reason, or you just need more pressure on the battlefield. You can just activate this, make it a 2/2, and then get in for additional points of damage. But yet again, Mono Red is one of those lists, you either hate it or love it. But yet again, it's a list that's probably going to be the meta for quite some time, probably until even past rotation overall. And the next deck up on this list is going to be Boros Convoke. And this is a deck that's making a lot of waves. I think there's many iterations, but really the one thing that is standing out for this list is going to be the War Leader's Call. It's a card that's going to buff all your small creatures by giving them an additional +1/+1. And then it has this additional effect that whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control, and this is out, we're going to deal 1 damage to each opponent based on how many creatures we control. The deck takes advantage of playing various cards that produces multiple creatures for the price of 1. You have things like Resolute Reinforcements, which is a 2 mana 1/1 that makes a soldier token when it comes out, so it's like getting 2 points of damage just from playing this one card for 2 mana. You have Gleeful Demolition, which is a card that costs 1 mana. You destroy an artifact. If we control that artifact, we make 3 goblin creature tokens. So basically for 1 mana, you have this War Leader's Call out. You can make 1 mana 2/2 goblins that will then deal 3 damage to your opponent's face. You have things that help with that effect with things like Vodarian Epicure, which is it comes in the battlefield, deals 1 damage to each opponent, and you create a blood token. You have Yorian Frontliner, which helps buff our creatures, or itself could be used to be sacrificed for the effect of Lethal Demolition, then be unearthed later in the game when we maybe want to use it for additional buffs. Novice Inspector makes a clue token that we use for card draw, or make use of the clue token for the Gleeful Demolition. Word in the Sky is very great. We are playing Convoke, so we want to tap things down, get some sort of advantage here. We can tap 3 untapped things we control, give this card +1/+1, and then scry 1 to find maybe a way to help finish off our opponent as quickly as possible. A couple other cards in this list that kind of help us either refill or take advantage of what's happening on the battlefield. You have Knight Errant Eos, another card that is really a strong Convoke card. We're playing a lot of small creatures that we can easily tap down, drop a Knight Errant Eos very early in the game, and kind of, refill our hand back up after dropping a bunch of creatures. You have Case of the Gateway Express. This is an interesting case card from the new set that ETBs choose target creature you don't control. Each creature we control deals 1 damage to that creature. So it's kind of one of those little bit of spot removals, maybe to get that pathway open for a decently strong attack. And then the final card in this list, which is kind of like the finisher outside of the War Leader's Call, is going to be the Imodane's Recruiter. Just casting this for 3 mana, making a 2/2 that buffs all our other creatures additional +1/+1, and then giving them haste is quite strong. And if we really want to, we can get a little spicy and tap it for 5 mana if we have that mana, and make 2/2 White Knight tokens as well. But overall, this is a very interesting list, definitely a very powerful list. It's definitely making the waves on the meta. It will definitely be one of those things as the meta develops further and this kind of deck stands a little bit longer out on the meta. Will there be ways that other decks are going to try to counteract this kind of effect overall, just because it is quite powerful, quite good? It can win very quickly, and that's kind of the reason why it's kind of jumped its way up towards the top of the list overall. And the final deck up on this list is going to be Selesnya Enchantments. So this is another deck that's just been around pretty much ever since Kamigawa came out in one way or the other. For the most part, most of the main pieces really haven't changed. It's at this point probably been so fine-tuned that really you can't add anything really new to it, because the cards that are in here are probably the best cards that you could have in this list. It's playing a lot of cards that you've probably seen a ton of times. You have Generous Visitor here, a way to give +1/+1 counters on target creature control every time we cast an enchantment. Commune with Spirits to dig a little bit deeper, find either reveal an enchantment or a land from the top 4. You got Audacity in here, which helps give our creatures that we're growing that may not have trample, and +2/+0. Also, if this leaves the battlefield at any point, we do get to draw a card. You have Skrell's Hive here as a very solid way to protect our enchantment creatures that we maybe want to keep on the battlefield by giving our either paying life or tap in for 1 white. We give it a hexproof from a particular color until end of turn. Mashako is just a card that's going to overwhelm your opponent with 1 cast of this. You have 2 triggers of giving +1/+1 for each artifact or enchantment we control. Ossification is a solid way to remove something from the battlefield, get out of your way until this leaves the battlefield. You have Spirited Companion, just a 2-drop that draws us a card, which is also very good. Typically white and green don't have a lot of ways of drawing cards, and Companion does that in itself. Kami of Transience, it's a 2-mana 2/2 that just grows every time we cast an enchantment spell. And at the beginning of our end step, we can return this from the graveyard if an enchantment has gone to the graveyard from the battlefield this turn, which is kind of one of those more annoying things, but definitely a very good effect overall. We have Harmony, which buffs our other enchantment creatures by additional +1/+1. But the tap a green and tap it, copy target activator trigger ability of an enchantment we control. Is going to be the kind of the highlight of this card here. You copy the Spirited Companion, you copy the Ossification, you copy the Mashakos. You copy any sort of triggered effect. You even copy the Calyx effect if you really have Calyx out after tapping this. Jeskai Naturalist has a little bit of enchantment discount, which is quite good for a 2-mana 2/2. And then you also have Catilda here as a one-off in the deck. It gets buffed when this comes out as a creature based on how many permanents we control that are spirits and or enchantments. This deck is mostly enchantments, so it's going to be quite big. And in itself, if it goes to the graveyard because this creature has died, you then can return it as a legendary enchantment, given any creature you control +X/+X, where X is based on the number of spirits or enchantments we control. Overall, it's like I said, this is a list that hasn't really changed too much. It is a list that is quite good, especially early in metas, just because it's so fine-tuned that it overperforms against decks that where people are still experimenting with overall. And even if as the meta develops further and more decks kind of start rising towards the top, I'm sure this deck will still be in the top 10 of meta decks overall. But overall, it's one of those things with this list. It is subject to change. We have other events that are popping out. There may be people doing some secret tech that we don't really know about. So it is something, any of these decks could be in the meta today, but they may drop off the meta later just because maybe they just don't overperform as other decks get adjusted and changed as the meta, kind of shifts and goes. I'll be quite honest, based on this meta, it doesn't seem like Karlov Manor really had the biggest impact on the meta overall. It doesn't seem like the cards are that powerful when compared to other decks that have cards from other sets, but that typically happens when you have such a large meta. We have such a large library of cards that we now can make decks out of compared to maybe the old weight standard was. Now we're going into almost 15 sets of cards you can make decks out of, whereas typically I think at maximum you typically only had. With that being said, that's going to wrap up the video. Overall, this meta list really is not anything super crazy, super exciting. I think the meta has kind of been the same way it's been. I think some of the only thing that's really different, some things have shifted around where they are overall in the current meta. I think the meta is still going to shift a little bit more, where some of the decks will probably shift around where they rank overall in terms of win rate, as people make adjustments based on some of the newer decks that popped up. But overall, the meta has been kind of the same. It is something I think we're getting to the point in standard, even with the larger pool of cards we have access to, that really a set has to be super powerful or it has to come out with something really special really to get any sort of impact on the overall meta in general. And like I said, this is something that kind of happens with older formats that don't rotate, that you don't really, it takes a lot of good cards really to make a significant change in a meta that's already developed for the most part. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Is there any deck that stood out to you? Is there something that you're interested in playing? I'd like to hear your thoughts. If you like this video, hit that like button. Definitely lets me know that you guys like these style of videos. If you're new here, you want to know when I post new videos like this one here on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But until next time, I'll see you in the next video.